Thanks for tuning in today for another new and exciting episode from Stock Car Facts, which we try to post every Tuesday at about noon. Or you can watch some of our previous episodes. Here at Stock Car Facts, we would really love to recreate the race day sights, smells, and sounds that we first experienced for ourselves in 1974 at Michigan International Speedway. But unfortunately, that's not possible here. However, we can do the next best thing in that we can share with you what happened at these events, and we can talk to those people who created those memories. Or, those facts. So we'd appreciate it if you sit back and relax and enjoy this latest episode today of Stock Car Facts with me, your host, Kevin Schwarzy. Oh, and by the way, later, you'll have a chance to comment on this content. And, if you haven't already, please hit the like button as well as the follow bell to be notified of brand new shows right here. And we'd appreciate it if you'd share this on all of your social media platforms. Thank you. Today on Stock Car Facts, content creators and hit that bell on the side to get notifications so that when we have special guests on. And I'm telling you right now, I'm excited. I always say I'm excited, but I've known this guy, easily 40 years.
40 plus.
Boy, we need to not date ourselves here. We're
joking. We don't look like we're 58.
Yeah, right. Well, like I was saying earlier, I'm half the man. I was half the man then than I am today, but you're still looking great, except for that gray hair. But
well, that's okay.
Yikes! Yeah. I put it on and color's messed up. But now people are going, well, who's this guy? Well, this guy is Bob Laird, and we are in Martinsville, Virginia. And what would we call this here that we're at? Because fans can see the 67 and they know it's the Buddy Arrington car, but what would you call this where we're at?
This is probably a collection of Buddy's son Joey, who was the crew chief engine builder for the team.
Who was on our show.
Yeah, he was about a year ago. And he has bought an old Sears building here in Martinsville, Virginia. And in doing so, he is turning it into a service center for cars and trucks and so forth. And also, what you see behind us and what we'll probably show later in the show is a collection of what he's gotten over the years. What I'll call toys. Also, a lot of memorabilia that has passed through Buddy's hands and Joey's hands and are on display for everyone to see it. So I think sometime down in the future, this will be a museum type of facility.
And so far, he's got so much neat stuff in here. We will do a tour of the museum. Call it later.
Call it that.
So you fans, you got to tune back in.
Yeah.
As I always say, tune back in. Give us those views. But what I want to start with is, for folks from the '80s, you'll remember Bob. But from the fans today, no offense, but they're like, who? Now they'll remember Buddy.
Yeah.
And they'll remember Richard Petty, the Chrysler guys. But they don't know who Bob Laird is. But I'm going to tell you something. Bob's family is part of the iconic history of NASCAR. And if you wouldn't mind, why don't you get into that a little bit?
Sure. It all started, I guess, in a sort of a strange bedfellows. And I hate to use the word bedfellows as air quotes. Because my father and later my stepfather were good friends, and they used to go to the races together. And
you're talking 60s, 70s?
You're talking in the 60s. Yes, they would go to Darlington from Pennsylvania, drive down Darlington. And this is probably, this is late 50s, because this is like Fireball Roberts days. This is like 57, 58. So they went as like 20-year-olds down to Darlington. And then my dad married my mom, and in 59, 60, I forget which year it was now. But as things sort of progressed, my mom fell in love with the sport, my dad fell out of the sport, and Jack, who was my stepfather later, sort of going to the races together. So we won't go too far into the weeds. You can do a little bit of math, but anyway,
of course,
yeah, you can do a little bit of math,
right.
But that's how the racing started. And I started in the early 70s, going to the races, and my mother, and then not quite my stepfather yet, Jack, were involved with the Petty Fan Club, and they became advisors in Pennsylvania. Each state back then had advisors, and they were running the Pennsylvania chapter out of Willow Grove, where I was living,
which is north of Philly, I believe.
That's correct, northwest of Philly, suburb, and not exactly the hub of stock car racing.
No.
But after a few years, it then became apparent that they needed somebody, I don't want to say younger, but just maybe a little bit more go-getter. And they, Hugh Carrick and Bob Preddy, who were involved with Richard, approached my mother and Jack at that time to become national advisors or directors of the fan club, and that's what happened. And in sometime around the mid-'70s, they became presidents, national directors of the fan club until 1992 when Richard retired. And during that time is when my love of racing sort of reached its pinnacle, and just I was like 13, 14 years old.
Hey, you egomaniac, we'll get to you. So.
Yeah. That's right.
Let's get back to this.
Sure.
Here. Because, you know, some of the kids watching this are going to go, yeah, fan club, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
But because, you really don't need one, technically, because you got drivers run their own Twitter, drivers on their own social media, for the most part.
Right.
So they don't need a fan club unless you send them for a hat and they go autograph sending you back. Back then, that was unheard of, to have a fan club.
Yeah.
He was one of the first, and it went off like an atomic bomb.
It was huge. And keep in mind that back then, as you mentioned, we didn't have social media. My mother and Jack would work painstakingly to develop newsletters, quarterly newsletters, to send out to fans by mail.
By mail,
with
we're talking stamp,
with stamp and everything else, and she would take these bins to the post office. I remember it, and then later she'd get like a meter and everything else to do it. But back then, she would take care of all the fan club packets, so they got stickers and patches and photos.
And they were on it. They weren't like screwing around. They weren't like, you're going to get your newsletter, you're going to get your patch.
Right.
6 months later, you maybe get a sticker. No, they were. I belonged to the Petty Fan Club. Obviously, everybody knows watching my show. They were consistent.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine the work that went into this.
Yeah, and it was all volunteer, and my mom loved it. Jack loved it because he loved the sport. My mom loved the sport, but she loved Richard. She loved everything about it, and it was her passion to do. And, again, you look back and what fan clubs were like back in the day, no one really had anything in racing. It wasn't...
Right.
And they sort of just said, well, let's get the manufacturers, let's get goodies and not goodies, powder, but like goody pieces from like manufacturers from.
By the way, this is Bob, and he didn't get paid to say that.
No, I did. That's
goodies is in like neat little.
I may have it in my console, but I'm not paid to say it. But they used to get all these kind of packets from these manufacturers. STP, of course. STP would have little packets of things, and
they would love it because free advertising.
Free advertising. It was a great
us.
Marketing aspect.
Yeah.
So, and that ties into the other part is that then they found out that all these fans of Richard were buyers of these products. So then they would give more and more items out. And so you joined for probably $5 back then, and you got a plethora of.
You get a bag.
Yeah,
of
stuff
at the races or whatever.
Yeah.
And not only that. Like you said, you're mailing out newsletters, but how's that news getting out? You got to go to the and you said state director.
Yeah.
Now, fans, think of that. People watching, think of that. It was so big, you had to have what do you call them, advisors in each state. Well, I don't know if they had one in Montana, but
at one time they had advisors in almost every state. It was amazing. Hawaii, Alaska.
Think about that number. Yeah. Do you remember any actual numbers as far as?
I don't recall.
No,
it was in the thousands of fan club members because the convention that you'll see it later of early on that you'll see that and it and that just grew over the years. But most of those people, it was called a fan club convention for a reason. Everybody from all parts of the country would hone in on Randleman and go there. Back then it was the early fall, but they would go there to see Richard and spend a day or two, and that's what they did. But that was the buildup. There was the culmination of everything to that fan club convention, and they started that fan club convention back in '73. So that was huge. But anyway, it was, each state had, if they would go to let's say you had an advisor in Virginia. Well, when Richard went to Richmond that year for the 2 races, the fan club would get together in Richmond, and at that time, the woman, and I remember it was Jenny Temple, was one of the fan club advisors, state advisors in Virginia. But she would get together, they'd rent out a room at a hotel and at a conference room, and Richard would come in and meet the fans and sign. So it was sort of a, like each state had its own fan club
responsibility.
Yeah, they did. So they were in charge of getting Richard to a function on Saturday after qualifying, and then bring him there, and he'd spend about an hour or two with the fans. And sometimes it was at the track, sometimes it was at the hotel. But each state, whether it be Alabama, Florida, Georgia, whatever it was back then, Michigan, everybody had an advisor and took care of that. And it was unique in that way, and no one else had anything like it. And I applaud my mom and Jack for doing it, because they were cutting edge at the time. And we're just talking about a fan club, but it was pretty cool to see everything sort of come into how it came into existence.
You talk about a convention, and there's some clips out on YouTube, because like Ken Squire would go to one of the conventions or whatever, and then he'd interview Richard or whatever. If you wouldn't mind talking about a convention, because the people that showed up to Randleman, I think outnumbered the number of people that lived in Randleman. I mean,
absolutely,
the lines were incredible.
Absolutely.
What would they do there? It wouldn't be just one day; it'd be 2 days.
Yeah, it
sometimes.
would be a tremendous amount of volunteers. So, and these were all petty fans, or back then, Linda, Richard's wife, would gather up a lot of volunteers from her church, from the local auxiliary, things like that, of Level Cross, Randleman, in that area, and we would have food there. And it would be given to us. I mean, you would pay a certain amount, but you'd have a meal out of it. You'd get, of course, some more goodies like you did before, but you'd have that opportunity that you would wait in line, and in most cases, almost all those conventions, people would wait in line 7-8 hours just to walk up to the king and have him sign something and get a picture with him. And Richard treated every one of those people like it was just one person. It was just that he was there for just that one person. One of the, from my point of view, one of my strongest role models that I have in my life was Richard. How he handled the fans, what he did, and everything about it was just incredible. A testimony to that way of life for him, and how he grew up, and how he appreciated the fame, and then he gave it back to the fans. And each fan left like they literally just met the king. And they did, and that was so important. But the fan club convention consisted of painstaking hours of just getting everything together, doing little side things, just giving away gifts, raffles,
pit stop contests sometimes, for example,
pit stop
shop tours
contests.
maybe.
You'll see that as well. The pit stop contests were huge, and Richard would take part in those as well. So he would come out there and change a tire and his
cowboy hat
and clothes. Yeah. Well, actually, back then he didn't have his cowboy hat.
Oh, you're right. Early 70s.
Later
you're right.
on, yeah. But in the 70s, early 80s, no, it wasn't that. He just would come out in his regular attire, and so each state would have their own fan club, pit crew. So we would have like a battle. And it was like, that was probably
I
the
know
highlight.
Pennsylvania won every year.
We won a couple years. But that was the sort of the highlight of the convention, was like this type of thing where everyone sort of could get involved, change a tire, jack the car, carry the tires, whatever it may be. And maybe you were lucky enough to work with Richard and on that pit crew. But there was so much going on, and everyone left happy. And all my mom stayed in the background. So you won't see her.
You never see her in a lot.
You never see her in a lot of captions, videos, pictures, whatever. What she did is she sat in the back and literally,
which is the way it should be,
and just
looked,
looked
something like that,
and saw that everyone had a good time. And she would point out to people, Did you see Richard today? Did you get an autograph? It was.
Did you get your goodie bag?
Yeah, yep. Did you get everything? Did you have a good time? And she was adamant about making sure that people had a good time. And I didn't really appreciate it then until I was older. But because you don't really think about stuff like that when you're 16, 17 years old or whatever.
Or even younger. It's like, why is Mom taking all this time to do this? Nah, you see.
Well, I wondered why Mom wasn't more in the forefront. Because that's sort of like how we are today. And it's not we put ourselves out there, but we want to make sure. But she just literally stayed in the back and just watched everything. And
anytime I did PR, and I know you too, the rule is, you don't need to see us.
No.
If you see us, we're not doing our job.
Right.
Our job is to make them stand out.
Right.
Because public relations. You never see pictures of your mom.
No, it wasn't. And everything you see is sort of in the background. Like a couple people took pictures that I have later on in years, and you never saw her with. I mean, she saw Richard maybe the Friday night before the convention to say this is what we're going to do, maybe for an hour. But that's it.
Yeah.
So she didn't really get to spend any time as like a fan to do that. So it was total respect for my mom to do that, and again, the way it should be.
Speaking of the fans, as far as size goes, a lot of people been to the museum, the Petty Museum, and they've seen that lawn that Leo used to putt on.
Yeah.
I mean, it's huge lawn. The house is in the back.
Yeah.
And there are some shots where they have the line going to the side and over.
Yes.
Some they go like the back and forth line, and I don't know how big it. I mean, it's a couple football fields.
Yes, it is.
And it was packed with people.
It was, and it was lined up going up from the Petty house to
the road,
the main road.
The numbers we're talking about at that convention, I mean, in 4 or 5 digit range.
Yeah, it was tens of thousands. It was tens of thousands, and
think about that, fans. And not to mean to interrupt you again,
that's
but
fine.
The perspective, some short tracks don't get that.
No.
And we're talking the 70s.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, any magazine you opened up.
Yeah.
Petty Fan Club, and then even when they were selling a little parcel of land, that kind of thing, or whatever. The STP. Now I know this wasn't your mom, but like for example, the STP, get your dollar back, signed by Richard and Kyle. That big thing.
Yeah.
So, but back then, again, we're inundated with social media. I mean, we have too much information, I think. But back then, to think about the magnitude that. Like you said, it went back to Richard, I'm sure. Because if it isn't a personality like Richard, it's not going to happen.
No. Richard was, his persona,
sold himself.
Everything about it. Yeah, it was just his classy way of doing things, his time for the fans, and people respect that, admired him, and of course he went on Sundays a lot too. As well, so
that doesn't hurt.
That did hurt a lot.
Yes.
But again, remember the memory I have is him just sitting on a director's chair or sitting out on the front porch.
I think one time even on the fender of his race car. I think. Can you imagine how uncomfortable
there
that
for
was?
hours upon hours, and he'd give the same infectious smile to
Same
every
swirl,
fan
too, that
and
autograph.
the autograph. And
it's not a quick.
No, it isn't.
Scribble.
It has morphed over the years to a much shorter signature.
It has, yeah.
But because he used to do a lot of swirls.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Anyway.
It's literally a work of art, the way he does it.
It was.
I even, as a kid, I think we all tried to imitate his signature. And you're just like, I can't do that.
Every time.
I've got too much going on. I can't
every
do that.
time. And he'd ask where you're from, and he'd ask what's your name, and take the picture, and it was just a great time in my life, and I remember that, and I just think we miss it today from a lot of different personalities in the sport.
But wouldn't you think that Travis? I mean, they all say, "Oh, the King is the one we look up to," but they don't act like that.
No, they don't.
Wouldn't you figure? I mean, the guy is 86 now, right?
Yeah, 85, 86. Yeah.
And he's still. I mean, wherever you go, there's still. You want to know who Richard Petty is? Look for the Mob.
Right.
Still today. Wouldn't you think that? Okay, I need to maybe, even if I copy this guy exactly, I'm not going to go wrong.
Right.
And these kids don't get it.
They don't get it. Well, keep in mind also that Richard Petty Fan Club still exists today, 31 years later.
Is that right?
Yes.
He
He still has a huge following. David Blake in Tennessee is now running the fan club. Just went blank here, but Linda Ritchie took over from my mom in 1993 when my mom retired from it, and they gave it up in '92. Linda Ritchie took over until she passed, unfortunately, and then David Blake became the president of the fan club.
I did not know that. I thought it was gone.
There is still a fan club convention every year. The last one was about a month ago, and they still gather on the front lawn. Yes, they still gather on the front lawn. And
are the numbers the same?
The numbers are not nearly the same, but keep in mind that most of those fans really have passed. I mean, you think about it. So
they have more gatherings.
Yeah, there's a lot more stuff going on, but
I saw him last month.
Richard still has a following, and he still thinks it's just as important now that the petty name is carried on.
Wow,
so,
I did not know it was still going. Wow, that's. Do you know how much membership is now today?
Oh, I think it's maybe $20 or something like that.
Which is still
famous.
But
everything's social media. Everything's emails and things like that. So it's not nearly like what it used to be, but you still get the access that some of the other fans don't get. So,
and like we were talking about, there was nothing like it. I mean, maybe there was like a send away for what 50s, 60s, whatever. Sign. If you go through this magazine, whatever, you get a hat or whatever, and Joe or Neil or whatever would sign it. Whoever.
Yeah.
But like a specific fan club.
Right.
So now looking ahead, then all of a sudden you got now this guy's got a fan club. This guy's got a fan club. Now, how did that make you guys feel to go? We were on the ground floor of this, and now everybody's doing it.
I don't think my mom ever looked at it that way. She looked at it as a way of how she could improve it every year from the inception. And
because they weren't really competing. I mean,
no, it wasn't. But you have. I guess the best way to explain it is that of how things have changed is that when Kyle started in '79, they wanted to do a Richard and Kyle Petty fan club, and Kyle really was. Kyle's a rebel. And I would say that to his face, but
he'll say it.
He wanted his own fan club, and that was sort of how things were. He really wanted to set himself apart from his dad, even
which
though
makes sense.
Which
to
I get.
Me now.
I look at that, but I thought, well, that's a little like, well, if it wasn't for your dad, you wouldn't be here. But also, you also look and say, well, there's also Kyle Petty fans that may not be necessarily Richard Petty fans. There may be younger fans that may not be Richard Petty fans. So
and a different message Kyle might want to send.
Right. So, but I get all that. But she was like, okay, Kyle wants his own fan club. Kyle can have his own fan club. We won't be involved with it. And so Kyle went off and did his own fan club. But she wanted to be different in all those areas. She didn't want it to be the same thing over and over. So she did try to do some different things over the years to try to set it apart. And I think one of the great things that they did was in the early 80s when the Grand National Wives Racing Auxiliary took place. They had a huge fundraiser where drivers would donate uniforms. And each year, that money would go directly to them. So they found a way to not just have a gathering anymore. How can we give back? How can we pay it forward? What can we do to help out maybe less fortunate ones or certain causes? And that was one of them. Muscular dystrophy was a big one with Richard back in the mid-'70s. So they did some with that.
Yes.
But the Grand National Wives Auxiliary was really the point where so much of this was giving back. And there were they raised probably $50,000-$60,000 in just what drivers would throw away, or sheet metal that Richard Petty would sign, or whatever it may be, old tires that were signed, $100, $200. But and I was a recipient of one of those back in '82. I got
so was my dad.
Dale Earnhardt. I got Dale Earnhardt's first driving uniform back then for $35.
Whoa! You can probably retire on that today.
Yeah, and later I ended up selling it for a little bit of money. But went to a fan who I wasn't going to be a big fan, but somebody wanted it.
Yeah.
But these people would just buy these things just.
One
to
man's
have.
junk is another man's treasure.
That's
Even the
true.
Earnhardt stuff is not
true.
junk.
And as you'll see, Dale Earnhardt signed it for me too as well. So. But he told me it was one of the first ones he ever got. But it was nothing. He had two of them. He just gave one away, and that's the way the drivers were. They're just like, well, okay, this year's over. You can have this uniform. You can have this uniform. But
then he got savvy.
And then.
But anyway.
Yeah. So it was. But that part to me was instrumental in how they just took from the fan club and gave back.
So today your mom has since passed.
Yes.
And your stepdad?
He passed away about 6 years ago.
Okay. Do you still get do you get anybody that recognizes you, talks about your mom?
Yeah, I
hey
do.
Bob,
There's one Sharon Fossler from Maryland who's about the only one left that was participating. She was a Maryland advisor. Her and her husband Bob are advisors in Maryland for many years, and I think she was maybe in her early 30s when this whole thing started. When her and her husband were doing this.
And Sharon, if you're watching, you still are.
And I still connect with her through messaging, phone calls every once in a while. She used to come down here for some big gatherings. I'd come and see her and some of the other people. But she's the one that goes back the farthest, that's still alive today and still remembers my mom and will send pictures every once in a while of her that she might find. But
that's
the great thing is that
like you said, there wasn't a lot with your mom,
right? And we get to share the memories and how far it's come from when she started and my mom started, and to where it became. But for me, that legacy to still be carried on is tremendous. And the Pettys did that too as well when she passed, and they made up a nice plaque. And as you'll see the pictures roll through, I'm sure today on this, Richard and my brother are holding the plaque to recognize my mom.